Mongolia is one of those countries we've all heard of, but know practically nothing about. The world's second largest landlocked country is as inhospitable as it is hostile. Winters can reach minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and are sometimes so harsh that not even the local livestock can withstand them. In the winter of 2009, for example, 8.5 million cattle perished in the cold. That's 1/5 of the country's entire total. As you can imagine, Mongolia is not a place where life is particularly easy. In fact, its extreme climate has meant that throughout history, very few people have settled in these lands. For example, despite being a territory almost 3 times larger than a country like Spain and only a little smaller than Mexico, its population barely exceeds 3 million inhabitants. That is, we are talking about one of the most sparsely populated places on the planet, one of the least inhabited territories, and also one of the poorest. However, VisualPolitik fans, Mongolia's luck might be about to change, or at least that's what we're hoping for, all thanks to the gigantic treasure this country hides beneath its depths. Mongolia is one of the richest mineral countries in the world. We're talking about copper, gold, uranium, oil, and immense wealth for a sparse population. Precisely for that reason, at the beginning of the century, as a way to escape from poverty, the Mongolian government, taking advantage of the economic pool of China, a huge devourer of natural resources, set to work to exploit this enormous wealth once and for all. In this way, Mongolia became a promising mining power, which, unsurprisingly, directs about 90% of its production to the People's Republic of China. Within a few years, money began to pour into the country and its economic growth rates climbed above 10% per year. The future looked promising. In a few years, Mongolia could be able to join the club of Asia's richest countries. But this is 2021, so the question is, has Mongolia really become such a rich and prosperous place? Well, let's say that if you think that in Ulaanbaatar they have replaced water with champagne and the traditional deal with a new Armani suit, you are very, very wrong. Easy money is not always as profitable as we think it is. Plus, when virtually your entire business is basically dependent on a single client, believe me when I tell you that you're in a much more compromised position than you might think. So the question is, what exactly happened to Mongolia? Check this out.
The Mongolian Dawn.
Okay, pay close attention to this graphic. This will be on the test. What you are looking at is the evolution of the GDP per capita of Mongolia, a very poor country whose economy has traditionally been linked to a very rudimentary type of livestock and agriculture. In addition, the fall of the communist bloc inflicted a heavy economic blow. Remember that until 1992, Mongolia was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. And yes, when it fell, a transition to a democratic free market model was set in motion, but many of the communist era political and productive structures survived. To make matters worse, there was also the phenomenon of the oligarchs who took control of former public companies at almost bargain basement prices. In 1997, in an attempt to revitalize the economy and escape the post-Soviet crisis, the government passed the Minerals Law. And you know what? It changed everything. The law was intended to encourage private investment, particularly from foreign capital, in the mining sector, a sector that until that time had been dominated mainly by small producers with very little mechanization. So, between 1997 and 2002, the Mongolian government issued almost 3,000 exploration licenses for the creation of new mines. And take note, because the licenses granted covered almost 4% of the country's entire territory. That's a gigantic country. We're talking about more than 23,000 square miles, a little more than 25% of the surface area of the entire United Kingdom. And no, most of these licenses did not end up in the hands of companies from the country you all have in mind. Look, for example, at the names of some of these companies. The Mongolian Resource Corporation, South Gobi Resources, Kankora Copper, Garrison International. They don't sound very Chinese, do they? Well, the reason they don't sound Chinese is because they're not. Most of the companies that got licenses to explore and exploit the Mongolian subsoil were companies from Canada and Australia, a few from the UK, Switzerland, and various other countries like that. In many cases, these companies formed joint ventures with the Mongolian government itself, so that the government would benefit from this activity not only through taxes and royalties, but also through its own share of the profits. It was a perfect business. Even more so, when almost all of these minerals that began to be exploited were exported to a relatively close neighbor, China, especially to the iron and steel production centers that consumed iron, coal, and other minerals as if there was no tomorrow. Up optimism was sky high. In just a few years, foreign investment skyrocketed from about 10 million in the early 1990s to more than 800 million at the peak of the mining boom in 2008. Also, between 2003 and 2008, exports increased fivefold to more than $1.8 billion. And don't forget that we are talking about a country with just over 3 million inhabitants. In per capita terms, these are huge figures, especially if we take into account that Mongolia was one of the poorest countries in the world. But that would soon change, because now money was pouring in and GDP was growing at breakneck speed. In just a decade, the size of its economy increased tenfold. Suddenly, investment projects of all kinds began to spring up and construction projects flooded the country. Mongolia's future looked bright. Suddenly, however, everything stopped. Mongolia stopped growing, investment stopped, and the country fell into chronic stagnation. The question is, why? What on earth happened to make it all go down the drain? Check this out.
Mining debacle or political debacle?
One thing is clear. For Mongolia, the mining boom had very significant benefits that are ongoing. There is no doubt about that. However, despite this, the frustration is more than evident. The 2008 crisis put the entire Mongolian mining model on the ropes. The economic recession halted the investment and export boom. In addition, demand and prices for key minerals plummeted. For example, the price of copper went from around $8,000 per ton in 2007 to around $2,500, a drop of almost 70%, and practically the same thing happened with the rest of the raw materials, which meant the government lost one of its main sources of income. Suddenly, surpluses turned into deficits, especially in terms of trade. Mongolia had specialized in the mining industry, which financed a lot of imports. Of course, this whole process triggered the public debt and, above all, the foreign debt, which currently represents 240% the size of the economy. In relative terms, it's the largest foreign debt in the world. Mongolia fell victim to what is known as Dutch disease. That is, the mining industry caused capital to flood into the country, driving both prices and the local exchange rate through the roof. And because the productivity of the companies was generally very low, rising labor costs and the unstoppable exchange rate caused many of these local companies to go bankrupt. The Mongolian economy thus became terribly dependent on the commodity sector, and when commodity prices collapsed, the storm was unleashed. But that's not all VisualPolitik fans. Look, according to a World Bank report, Mongolia has produced $28 billion worth of minerals since 2004. Of this money, the state has taken about $9 billion in taxes over 15 years. At the same time, however, the government has been borrowing almost the same amount, $8.7 billion. These loans were secured by the mineral revenues themselves. Remember that we are talking about a very poor country with a very small population, so this is still a huge amount of money. However, in 2019, there was barely $200 million in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, $200 million of almost $18 billion amassed since 2004 on account of minerals. And yes, we already explained that after the 2008 crisis, the budget went into the red, but that math just doesn't add up. So the question is, what on earth did the Mongolian government do with all of the money? And pay attention, because this is where the story gets interesting, and this will also be on the test. Okay, as you can probably imagine, corruption played a pretty important role. Yes, Mongolia is not the most transparent country in the world, and certainly not the most accessible to be able to estimate the true extent of corruption. However, as a result of leaks such as the Pandora Papers, it has been proven that, for example, the former Prime Minister was fond of buying properties all around the world. But no, the key to the missing cash lies not in corruption, but in massive vote buying. Vote buying has practically become institutionalized in Mongolian politics. For example, the current president, Ukhnagin Kurelshuk, yes, I know, that's not the correct pronunciation, that's not on the test, came to power with the slogan, Mongolia owns its resources. However, far from working on industrial investment plans or some political project to boost the economy, the first measure this president took when he came to power was to shower pensioners with money. That had been his big election promise, to distribute a payout amongst pensioners financed with loans guaranteed by raw materials. But why? Because pensioners are by far the most significant voting demographic in Mongolia. Firstly, because there's a lot of them. Secondly, because they have common interests. And thirdly, because their turnout is much higher than the rest of the voters. So in terms of votes, their influence is enormous. And pay attention, because we're not talking about one remote exception. This way of doing politics has become the norm for all political parties. And yes, something similar could happen in almost every country in the world. But nowhere else has the buying of votes with promises of hard cash been taken so far. Not even in, wait for it, Argentina. If you're playing VisualPolitik bingo, cross that off now. To give you an idea, of Mongolia's 3.2 million inhabitants, 2 million receive regular state funding.
The political parties don't need smart voters who are equipped with critical thinking. They need poor voters who are easily manipulated with cash when they need to be. Geralt Odd Erdenabilik, political scientist at Mongolian National University of Education.
In other words, Mongolian politicians use the mineral windfall to gain power. The problem is that the cow is running low on milk. Far from boosting development or building a sovereign wealth fund, Mongolian politicians have spent past, present, and much of the future mineral rents on handing out checks left, right, and centre. And I say future because loans have to be paid back. They do? Oh god, I need to call my bank. And all of this was used to finance checks that are basically financing imports in the absence of real reforms. So, VisualPolitik fans, the vast natural wealth gave Mongolia a chance to become a very rich country. However, political greed robbed them of that dream. But having got to this point, it's now over to you. Have you ever thought that natural resources could be a curse? How would you avoid it? Leave us your answer in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik, it's very important. And if you like what we do and you want to help us improve day by day, you can help us by joining our Patreon, which has various levels of benefits. Once again, thank you all very much for watching, all the best, and I'll see you next time.